The winter of 1888 came down on the High Valley like a hammer. It was not a slow, creeping cold that gave a person time to prepare their soul, but a sudden, brutal occupation. The wind came first, a thief that stole the last of the autumn warmth from the soil and stripped the aspen groves bare, leaving their white trunks standing like an army of skeletons. Then came the snow, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal fury that buried fences, erased paths, and transformed the familiar landscape into a hostile, alien world of white. The cold did not knock before it entered the log cabins of the settlement. It seeped through the chinking like a ghost, flowed under doors like a draft of black water, and coated the inside of window panes with intricate, mocking ferns of frost. For the families huddled inside, life became a simple, desperate equation of wood versus winter. The hearth was a hungry god that demanded constant sacrifice. Every log fed into its roaring mouth bought another hour of reprieve, another brief period where the cold was pushed back into the corners of the room. But the woodpiles, which had seemed so monumental in the lingering sun of September, were shrinking with an alarming speed. Men spent their days wrapped in oilskins and wool, their faces raw from the wind, felling frozen timber with axes that rang like cracked bells in the frigid air. The sound of their labor was the valley's heartbeat, a frantic, fearful rhythm against the ceaseless moan of the wind. The cabins themselves, built with the hard-won wisdom of generations, were failing. They were sturdy structures of notched pine and spruce, chinked with a mixture of mud and dried moss, designed to withstand the ordinary trials of mountain life. But this was no ordinary trial. The cold was a presence with weight and force. It found every tiny flaw, every hairline crack in the daubing, every gap in the floorboards. At night, families would sleep huddled together under piles of quilts and buffalo robes, only to wake with their breath frozen in clouds before their faces. The water in the buckets by the door was a solid block of ice by morning. The very logs of the walls seemed to cry out, groaning and cracking in the deep, sub-zero temperatures as the frost penetrated their fibers. This struggle was universal. In the cabin of Thomas, the settlement's most respected builder, the fight was just as grim. He had built his home with his own hands, selecting each log for its straightness and girth. His chinking was meticulous, his stone fireplace a masterpiece of draft and draw. Yet even here, the cold was winning. His wife kept a kettle perpetually simmering over the fire, not for tea, but so its steam might add a sliver of moisture to the painfully dry air and fight back the encroaching chill. His children, their faces pale and pinched, rarely strayed more than a few feet from the hearth. They were burning through their wood at a rate that Thomas, a man who planned everything, found terrifying. He knew, with a cold knot of dread in his stomach, that if this winter did not break, their stores would not last. He was doing everything he knew how to do, everything his father had taught him, and it was not enough. Amidst this shared communal struggle, one figure stood apart. Ilara had arrived in the valley 2 years prior, a widow with a young son named Silas, and a quiet, observant nature that some mistook for timidity. Her husband had been an engineer, a man fascinated by geology and thermodynamics, and he had filled her head not with gossip and social graces, but with principles of heat transfer, hydrology, and the patient, immense power of the earth itself. He had died of a fever the first spring, leaving her with a small plot of land, a handful of his books filled with diagrams and equations, and the settlement's pity. They saw her as a fragile thing, ill-suited for the harsh realities of this life, a woman alone, who would surely fail without a man to chop her wood and patch her roof. While others were rushing to complete their cabins before the first snow, felling trees and stacking logs in a frenzy of traditional construction, Ilara did something that baffled the entire valley. She did not build up, she dug down. Her chosen site was a gentle slope near the back of her property, a place others had ignored because of a small, persistent spring that bubbled from the ground, creating a patch of marshy earth. The spring ran year-round, never freezing, not even on the coldest mornings when the rest of the world was locked in ice. To the others, it was a nuisance, a sign of poor drainage that would lead to rot and dampness. To Ilara, it was a promise. She had spent weeks observing it, measuring its temperature, watching its steady, reliable flow. It was the heart of her idea, an idea gleaned from her husband's books and her own careful observations of the natural world. She would not fight the cold with a massive, ravenous fire. She would invite the earth's own warmth into her home. Her plan was radical, a quiet rebellion against every established practice of building in that valley. She would construct her cabin over the spring, not to live in dampness, but to harness the constant, gentle heat of the water. She envisioned a foundation that was not just a base, but a living part of the home's heating system. A sealed stone channel would guide the spring water beneath a thick flagstone floor. The water, emerging from deep within the earth at a stable 50 degrees, would warm the stones. The stones, in turn, would become a massive thermal battery, slowly and evenly radiating that warmth into the small space above. The cabin would not be hot, but it would be stable. It would be a shelter that worked with nature, not one that waged a constant, losing war against it. The community's reaction was swift and predictable. It began with confused whispers and progressed to open mockery. Thomas, walking by her plot one afternoon, saw her marking lines in the dirt with a stick, her son Silas moving stones into a neat pile. He stopped, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "What is this, Ilara?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of his authority as the valley's master builder. "A foundation for a cabin needs to be on high, dry ground. You're building in a swamp." Ilara looked up, her hands smudged with dirt, her expression calm. "The ground is not a swamp, Thomas. It is a source. The water will not be in the house, but under it." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Under it? You'll have a house of mold and sickness. The damp will creep into the logs, and they'll be rotten in 5 years. And where is your hearth? I see no space for a proper fireplace. A cabin without a strong fire is a tomb in this country." He gestured with a broad, dismissive hand. "This is foolishness. You are building your own grave." His words, meant as a stern warning from a place of superior knowledge, were echoed by others. The men who passed by on their way to the timber stands would pause and chuckle, shaking their heads at the sight of the lone woman and her boy digging a complicated trench where a simple log foundation should be. "The widow's folly," they called it. The women, when they gathered at the creek to draw water, would speak of her in hushed, pitying tones. "Poor thing, her grief has unsettled her mind," one would say. "Someone should step in before she and that boy freeze to death," another would add. Their skepticism was a wall as solid and cold as the mountains that surrounded them. It was the heavy certainty of people who believe their way is the only way, that tradition is a fortress that protects them from the unknown. They offered her advice, all of it the same. "Stop this madness. Build a proper cabin. Build it the way it has always been done." Ilara listened to their warnings, their mockery, and their pity. She nodded politely, thanked them for their concern, and then she returned to her work. She did not argue or try to explain the principles of thermal mass to men who trusted only in the tangible reality of a roaring fire. Her husband's books were filled with the physics of it, but these were not people of books. They were people of axes and adzes, of muscle and sweat. To them, heat was a loud, visible, violent thing, the crackle and blaze of burning pine. Her concept of a vast, slow, silent warmth radiating from the very earth was a fantasy. the dream of an unpractical mind. So she did not speak of it. She worked. Her vindication, she knew, would not be found in words, but in the quiet, enduring comfort of the shelter she was building. Her son's survival depended on it. The work was a slow, arduous prayer. Elara rose before the sun, her breath pluming in the crisp morning air, and worked until twilight painted the snow-dusted peaks in shades of purple and rose. Silas, though young, worked alongside her, his small hands helping to clear loose dirt or carry smaller stones. Her isolation was complete. The sounds of construction from the rest of the settlement, the rhythmic thud of mallets, the sharp crack of axes, the shouts of men raising log walls, were a constant reminder of her divergence. They were building communities of shared labor, raising barns and cabins together. She was building alone, her only companion the steady, gurgling murmur of the spring. Her first task was the foundation, the heart of her entire design. She did not just clear and level the ground. She excavated a complex network of channels, lining them with flat, carefully chosen river stones. The main channel captured the spring's flow at its source and guided it in a gentle, winding path directly beneath the area where the main room would be. She worked with a trowel and her bare hands, fitting the stones together like a puzzle, using a fine clay slurry to seal the joints. It had to be perfect, a closed system that would contain the water completely, preventing any moisture from seeping upward into the floor. The men who saw her on her knees in the mud, meticulously placing each stone, shook their heads. They could raise the 4 walls of a cabin in the time it took her to finish one small section of her trench. While she toiled in her ditch, the rest of the valley was a hive of conventional activity. Thomas's newest cabin, built for a family that had just arrived, was rising with impressive speed. The community had come together for the raising, a dozen men heaving the great, notched logs into place. Their movements were practiced, efficient, a dance of synchronized labor passed down through generations. They worked hard and fast, driven by the urgency of the approaching winter. They slapped thick layers of mud and moss into the gaps between the logs, confident in the time-tested method. By the time Elara had finished her stone-lined aqueduct and was ready to lay her floor, their cabin was complete, a plume of smoke already rising from its new stone chimney. They were stockpiling wood, their saws singing through the forest, creating stacks of fuel that rose like defensive walls around their homes. Their preparations were a flurry of visible, frantic effort. Elara's work, in contrast, was quiet, internal, and focused on principles they could not see. Once the channels were complete and covered with massive, flat slabs of slate she and Silas had levered out of a nearby creek bed, she began the floor. It was not made of wood, which would rot from the subtle condensation and block the radiant heat, but of thick, dark flagstones. She spent a week fitting them, chipping away at their edges with a hammer and chisel until they lay together with barely a crack between them. This stone floor was her heat sink, her thermal battery. It would absorb the gentle, constant warmth from the water flowing below, and then release it slowly, steadily, into the room above. It was a concept of patience, of accumulation and slow release, the opposite of a fire that blazed hot and then died to cold ash. Then came the walls. Here, too, she diverged from the norm. Instead of a single wall of thick, solid logs, she built 2 thinner walls, one inside the other, with a 6-inch gap between them. This was a technique she had read about in one of her husband's journals, a design for cold-weather research stations. The space between the walls was the crucial element. As the men hauled massive logs, she and Silas gathered bags and bags of dried moss, cattail fluff, and dry grasses. They spent days packing this material tightly into the cavity between the inner and outer walls. It was tedious, dusty work. The result was a wall that was not solid bone, but a layered skin, like an animal's pelt. The packed insulation would trap the air, and still air, as her husband's book explained, was one of the most effective barriers to heat loss. Her roof followed the same principle, with a thick layer of sod and packed grasses sandwiched between the rafters and the final wood sheeting. Her windows were small, facing south to catch the low winter sun, and she painstakingly crafted inner shutters that could be sealed tight at night. The entire structure was designed not to generate heat, but to hold it, to capture every precious degree of warmth from the earth, from the sun, from the small cooking stove, and to keep it inside. The cabin grew slowly, a testament to her diligence. It did not look like the other cabins. It seemed smaller, more hunkered down, as if it were growing from the earth rather than sitting upon it. The mockery from the neighbors softened into a kind of resigned pity. They saw her tireless labor, and while they still believed her efforts were doomed, they could not help but respect her tenacity. They simply saw it as a tragedy in the making, a monument to a fool's errand. By the time the first snows came, her small cabin was complete. It had no grand fireplace, only a small, efficient cast-iron stove in one corner, with a narrow pipe for a chimney. It was meant for cooking and for providing a small amount of supplemental heat on the very coldest days. Her woodpile was a quarter the size of her neighbor's. To them, it was the final, definitive proof of her folly. To her, it was a symbol of her confidence. The true hearth of her home was silent and invisible, flowing steadily beneath her feet. She and Silas moved in as the valley settled into the grim reality of winter. Her small, strange cabin, a quiet question mark against the stark, white landscape. She had done the work. She had followed the principles. Now, all she could do was wait for the test. The test arrived not as a single event, but as a siege. The great storm did not simply pass over the valley. It settled upon it, a malevolent entity determined to break whatever stood against it. The sky turned a slate gray, thick and low, and the air grew unnaturally still. Then the wind began, a low moan that rose over the course of an hour to a shrieking, deafening howl. It was a physical force, a wall of moving air that shook the sturdy log cabins on their foundations. It slammed against the walls like a battering ram and tore at the roofs with invisible claws. Snow flew not from above, but from all directions at once, a blinding, suffocating blizzard of ice particles that stung any exposed skin and found its way through the tiniest of openings. The temperature plummeted. It fell past 0, past 10 below, settling into a realm of cold that was actively hostile to life. Metal became brittle enough to snap. Trees, their sap frozen solid, exploded with a sound like a gunshot in the deep of the night. It was a cold that felt ancient and absolute, a power that mocked the very idea of shelter. Inside the traditional cabins, the battle for survival became desperate. The wind, like a relentless interrogator, found every weakness in their construction. It forced the snow deep into the chinking, where it melted from the interior warmth and then refroze, expanding and creating new cracks. Icy drafts sliced through the rooms like knives. In Thomas's home, the situation was dire. His magnificent fireplace, once a source of pride, was now a tyrant. It consumed wood with a ferocious appetite, yet the heat it produced seemed to flee up the chimney, sucked out by the pressure of the wind. The stone walls of the hearth were warm, but 5 feet away, the air was glacial. A thick layer of frost, like a coat of white paint, grew across the interior of the north-facing wall. His children were bundled in so many layers they could barely move, their faces peering out from hoods of wool and fur. They had moved their beds into the small space directly in front of the fire, but the drafts still found them. Thomas spent his hours shuttling wood from the rapidly dwindling pile outside, each trip a brutal ordeal against the storm. The wind tore the breath from his lungs, and the biting snow blinded him. He could feel his home, his masterpiece, failing. It was a ship of wood and stone foundering in a sea of white, and he was helpless to stop it from taking on water. The story was the same throughout the settlement. In one cabin, a family woke to find a section of their chinking had been blown out entirely, leaving a gaping hole through which the blizzard screamed. They spent hours trying to stuff it with blankets and rags, their hands growing numb and useless in the process.
In another, the wellhead froze solid, forcing the father to try and melt snow for water, a slow, fuel-intensive process. The community, which had always felt close-knit and strong, was now a collection of isolated, freezing islands. The shared confidence in their building methods, in the wisdom of their traditions, was freezing and cracking, just like the logs of their walls. They were all suffering the same fate, a testament to a universal flaw. But inside Ilara's small, low cabin, the world was different. The sound of the storm was a distant, muffled roar, the fury of the wind softened by the double walls packed with moss and grass. The air inside was still. There were no drafts, no icy currents of air snaking across the floor. The single greatest difference was the floor itself. The flagstones were not warm to the touch, not like a heated hearth. They were simply not cold. They held a neutral, constant temperature, a quiet rebuttal to the Arctic fury raging just inches away on the other side of the foundation. That constant 50-degree water, flowing tirelessly in its sealed channel below, was performing its silent miracle. It was warming the massive stone slab of the floor, and that slab, in turn, was radiating a gentle, even heat into the small, well-sealed space. The temperature inside the cabin hovered around a steady 55 degrees. It was not the sweltering heat of a room with a roaring fire, but it was a comfortable, life-sustaining warmth. It was an even warmth that filled the entire space, from corner to corner. Ilara and Silas did not need to huddle by the stove. They could sit at their small table, Silas reading a book while Ilara mended a shirt, their movements unencumbered by excessive layers of clothing. The small cooking stove was lit, its cheerful glow adding a few extra degrees of heat and allowing Ilara to prepare a warm stew, but it was not fighting a desperate battle. It was merely supplementing a system that was already working. The frost that coated the inside of her neighbor's windows was absent here. Her small panes of glass were clear, beaded only with a bit of condensation, a sign of the warmth and moisture being held within the home. Her creation was being tested by the worst the world could throw at it, and it was holding. It worked. The contrast was absolute. In the valley's dozen other cabins, there was a frantic, desperate struggle, characterized by roaring fires, howling drafts, and shrinking woodpiles. Life had been reduced to the primal, fearful task of staying warm for one more hour. Families were burning through 3, 4, even 5 cords of wood, the product of a whole summer's labor, in a matter of days. Their homes were zones of extreme temperatures, scorching hot near the fire and freezing cold everywhere else. The air was thick with smoke and the constant, unnerving sound of the wind. Fear was the dominant emotion, a cold guest who had sat down at every hearth. In Ilara's cabin, there was calm. The interior temperature, a steady 55 degrees, never wavered. It was a quiet, enveloping warmth, a warmth you could forget about, which was the truest kind of comfort. Silas played on the floor with his carved wooden animals, his fingers nimble, his cheeks rosy. Ilara moved about the single room with an unhurried grace, the desperate anxiety that gripped her neighbors completely absent. Her woodpile, the one they had mocked for its meager size, was barely diminished. She had used only a few small logs each day in the cooking stove. The great, invisible hearth beneath her feet demanded no fuel, only the steady flow of the earth's own water. Her home was not fighting the cold. It was ignoring it. It was a small bubble of equilibrium in a world gone mad with entropy. The first visitor arrived on the third day of the blizzard. It was Thomas. He was not coming to check on her out of neighborly concern, but out of a desperate, gnawing curiosity that had finally overpowered his pride. His own family was suffering. He had just been forced to break up a wooden crate for firewood, the sound of the splintering wood echoing the cracking of his own certainty. The thought of the widow and her boy, alone in that flimsy, fireless cabin, had become an unbearable weight on his conscience. He imagined the worst, that they had already succumbed to the cold, their strange little house a frozen tomb. He had to know. He wrapped his face in a scarf, pulled his hat down low, and plunged into the blinding white chaos. The journey was a brutal fight against a wall of wind and ice. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the air was so cold it burned his lungs. When he finally stumbled toward her cabin, he could barely see it through the swirling snow. It was half buried in a drift, looking more like a part of the landscape than a human dwelling. There was no smoke rising from the thin stovepipe, a detail that sent a fresh spike of fear through him. He hammered on the door with a gloved fist, his knuckles numb, shouting her name against the roar of the storm. The door opened. Ilara stood there, holding a small lantern. She was wearing a simple wool dress, not the mountain of coats and shawls his own wife was buried under. Behind her, he could see Silas sitting at the table, looking up at him with placid curiosity. But what struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow was the air that flowed out of the cabin. It was not a blast of fiery heat, nor was it the deathly chill he had expected. It was just calm, still, an absence of the biting, invasive cold that had become his entire reality. He stood there, speechless, the wind whipping at his back, staring into this impossible pocket of tranquility. "Thomas," Ilara said, her voice even, "you should not be out in this. Come in." She stepped back, holding the door for him. He stumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, sealing out the storm's scream. The sudden silence was as shocking as the change in temperature. He slowly unwrapped the scarf from his face, his eyes wide, taking in the scene. The room was small, simple, and lit by the soft glow of the lantern. There was no roaring fire. The little cooking stove had only a few glowing embers within it. Yet the cold was gone. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, the deep, shivering ache in his bones, begin to ease. He looked at Ilara, then at the floor, then back at her. His mind, the mind of a practical builder who understood logs and stones and the simple physics of a chimney, could not process what he was experiencing. "How?" he managed to stammer, his voice hoarse. "Where is your fire?" He instinctively held out his hands, expecting to find a source of heat, but there was none. Ilara offered no grand explanation, no triumphant declaration. There was no hint of "I told you so" in her eyes, only a quiet, weary compassion. She understood the journey he had just made, not just through the snow, but through the wreckage of his own certainty. She simply gestured to a chair. "Sit, Thomas. Let me get you some hot broth." Her triumph was not in words, but in the simple, undeniable fact of her warm, peaceful home. It was in the gentle, even air. It was in the sight of her son, safe and comfortable. It was a victory of such profound humility that it left no room for pride or blame. It was simply the truth, radiating up from the stones beneath his feet. He sank into the chair, a man whose entire world had just been irrevocably and quietly turned upside down. Thomas sat in the chair, the warm mug of broth cradled in his hands, and said nothing for a long time. He was a man unaccustomed to being wrong, especially about the things he had built his life and reputation upon. He listened to the muffled howl of the wind outside, a sound that had been the soundtrack to his own family's misery, and here it was, just background noise. He watched Silas carefully move a small wooden horse across the table. The boy was not shivering. His nose was not red. He was simply a child, playing in his home. Thomas took a slow sip of the broth. The warmth spread through his chest, a stark contrast to the icy dread that had lived there for 3 days. He finally looked at Alara. "We are burning furniture," he said, the admission costing him a great deal. "The north wall of my house, it is covered in ice. Inside." He shook his head, not in disbelief anymore, but in a kind of weary wonder. "And you are here, like it is an autumn evening." He touched the stone floor with the toe of his boot. "The spring. It was the spring." "The spring is constant," Alara replied softly. "The earth holds its heat. I only built a way to let it in." She did not boast. She stated a fact, as simple and profound as the principle itself. Her quiet dignity was more powerful than any argument could have been. She had not defeated the winter. She had made peace with it, using one of its own rules against it. Thomas stayed for an hour, soaking in the impossible calm, the feeling of safety. When he finally stood to leave, to return to the cold, failing world of his own making, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of a full apology, a concession, and a plea. Word of Thomas's visit did not spread immediately, for the storm held the valley in its icy grip for 2 more days. But when the blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white under a painfully bright sun, the news traveled quickly. It was carried by Thomas himself. He did not hide his experience. He recounted it with the stark honesty of a convert. He told his closest neighbors, the ones whose faces were as gaunt and weary as his own. "The widow's cabin is warm. She has found a better way." The initial reaction was disbelief, colored by the lingering trauma of the storm. They thought perhaps Thomas's mind had been affected by the hardship. But his insistence, his solemn certainty, planted a seed of curiosity. The next day, 2 more men, their own woodpiles reduced to almost nothing, made the trek through the deep snow to Alara's plot. They approached with skepticism, but they too were met with the same quiet miracle. They stepped from a world of brutal, biting cold into a room of gentle, even warmth. They saw for themselves the lack of a proper fire, the clear windows, the comfortable child. They left as changed as Thomas had been, their mockery replaced by a profound and unsettling awe. The laughter that had once echoed around the name "The Widow's Folly" died out completely, replaced by hushed, respectful whispers. The true shift came a week after the storm. The valley was beginning to dig itself out, clearing paths, checking on livestock, and counting the cost of the great blizzard. Thomas appeared at Alara's door again. This time he was not a desperate refugee from the cold, but a humble supplicant. In his hands he held not an axe, but a pencil and a small, leather-bound notebook. His pride, which had been as solid and unyielding as frozen oak, had been thawed by her quiet success and his own stark failure. "Alara," he said, his eyes meeting hers directly. There was no artifice in his gaze. "I was wrong, arrogant and wrong. The way I have been building, it is not enough for this place. I see that now." He held up the notebook. "Will you teach me? Will you show me what you know?" It was the most significant moment of all. The master builder, the guardian of the community's traditions, was asking to become a student. It was the symbolic surrender of an entire way of thinking. Alara invited him in, And this time, they did not speak of the storm. They spoke of principles. She brought out her husband's books, the pages filled with diagrams of thermal convection, sketches of Roman hypocausts, and calculations on the heat capacity of stone. She spread them on the table, and with a piece of charcoal, she began to draw on a spare piece of wood, explaining the concepts in simple, practical terms. She showed him how the double wall wasn't just two walls, but a blanket of trapped air. She explained how the thick stone floor acted like a reservoir, soaking up the earth's warmth and releasing it slowly, preventing the sharp peaks and valleys of temperature caused by a fire. Thomas listened with an intensity he usually reserved for squaring a foundation or sighting a roof beam. He asked sharp, intelligent questions about the flow of the water, the depth of the channels, the best materials for insulation. He was no longer a skeptic. He was an engineer, his practical mind grasping the simple, elegant genius of the system. He filled page after page of his notebook with sketches and notes, a new kind of wisdom taking root in his mind. Elara shared everything freely. There was no price for her knowledge, no demand for recognition. Her reward was the simple fact of a better way, a way that could keep families like hers and like his safe. The knowledge was not hers to own. It was a truth about the world, and she was merely its messenger. The spring that followed the great blizzard was a season of unprecedented change in the valley. The harsh lessons of the winter had been learned in the most brutal way possible. The community did not just repair the damage to their old cabins. They began to rebuild. And they rebuilt using a new blueprint. The sounds of construction that filled the air were different now. The ring of axes was joined by the scrape of shovels and the clink of masons' hammers on stone. The first step for every new structure was no longer felling trees, but digging a foundation, seeking out the damp, stable earth that they had once so carefully avoided. Thomas, armed with his notebook and his newfound understanding, became the project's foreman and most fervent evangelist. He led the crews, working alongside them, his authority no longer based on tradition alone, but on the humble and hard-won wisdom. He showed the other men how to lay the stone channels, how to fit the flagstones, how to build the insulated double walls. The widow's folly had become the valley method. Cabins began to rise that looked different from the old ones. They sat lower to the ground, their foundations deep and solid, their windows small and thoughtfully placed. The landscape of the settlement was physically changing, adapting, evolving. Pride had given way to pragmatism. The foolishness of one had become the salvation of all. The story of what happened in the valley did not remain there. That summer, a government surveyor passed through, mapping the territory. He stayed with Thomas's family in a newly retrofitted cabin that now featured a thick stone floor. The surveyor, a man of science and education, was fascinated by the design. He spent 2 days with Elara, filling his own notebooks with detailed drawings and notes on her methods. He had seen settlements like this all over the frontier, had heard the same stories of brutal winters and a desperate reliance on firewood. What he saw in this valley was not just a clever house, but a revolutionary solution to one of the frontier's most pressing problems. When he left, he carried the story with him. It was published in a dispatch back east, a small article in a journal for engineers and architects titled "On the Principles of Earthen Heating in Mountain Dwellings." The idea, stripped of its personal history and presented as a set of scientific principles, began to spread. Other settlements in cold climates, hearing of the method, began to experiment with their own versions. The quiet innovation of a lone woman, born of observation and necessity, rippled outward, becoming a part of the anonymous, evolving wisdom of the frontier. It was never named after her. It was simply called the insulated foundation, or the radiant floor.
Her legacy was not in a name, but in the countless families who would survive future winters, warm and safe, in homes that had learned to make peace with the cold. Years passed. The valley thrived. The new cabins proved their worth winter after winter. The Great Blizzard of '88 became a landmark in the community's history, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point, the harsh teacher that had forced them to become wiser. Ilara remained a quiet, respected figure in the community. She never sought credit or praise. She lived simply, raising her son, tending her garden, and watching the valley grow. Her greatest satisfaction came from the sight of smoke rising from the chimneys of her neighbors' homes on a cold day. Not the frantic, desperate plumes of a fire fighting for its life, but the gentle, lazy spirals from a small cooking stove in a house that was already warm. The final lesson the valley learned was not about construction, but about humility. They had been so certain in their knowledge, so locked in the traditions that had served them before, that they had become blind to a better way. They had laughed at the one person who dared to look at their oldest problem with new eyes. They learned that true wisdom isn't about having all the answers, but about being willing to question the ones you think you have. It's about observing the world with a patient and open mind, and recognizing that sometimes the most powerful solutions are not the loudest, but the most quiet and profound. The earth had always offered its warmth. They had simply never known how to accept it. Ilara had shown them how. She had taught them that survival is not always a matter of fighting the elements with brute force, but of understanding them with quiet intelligence.